Grab a bulletin, if you will, real quickly. Open up to the prayer list section. As you can see, there's been a few additions added to our prayer list that we have been keeping certain individuals in our prayers, such as June, who is battling kidney cancer. I was informed about that a few days ago from Sister Linda Klaus, a really good friend of theirs from Stamps. And so she's been battling kidney cancer, and so they're in desperate need of our prayers. So let's definitely keep them in our thoughts and in our prayers on a daily basis. We also see that we've been praying for Sister Rosa Lane. She is allowing visitors at the time, and she has been battling with cancer as well. As I mentioned before this morning's song, it's good to see Sister Dot back with us, but we are definitely going to continue on praying for her and her recovery as well. But we're very glad and excited to see her back with us. We're praying for Jackie Vines, his physical therapy that he has been going through. Sister Sherry as well, along with Brother Sonny's son, Charlie Hager, Tim and Richard Decker, Sue Treadwell, Henrietta Aycock, Sid and Margaret. They have been doing very well. Sid is still having a bit of dizzy spells, still kind of battling through, but he's been able to actually throughout the day get back to work on his 2 feet, so that's a good sign. Margaret has still been fighting against her shingles, so let's be praying for both of them, as well as our nation, victims of COVID-19, including our president and his family who has been diagnosed with that horrible virus. Let's continue to be praying for the Baker family, Brother Jerry's uncle. It's good to know to hear that he is definitely a member of the church and that Paradise has received a new resident. But let's be praying for the comfort of the family. Are there any updates that need to be made on the prayer list? Any additions that need to be made? Okay, if not, then we will go ahead and turn our attention to the Bible class session of Genesis chapter 36. Genesis chapter 36. Once again, we come across one of those chapters where it's names after name after name after name. Names that are very difficult to try to pronounce correctly, but it's okay if we struggle with some of those names, because I do almost all the time. But we often wonder, one of the biggest questions is, why is it in here? We often see these kinds of chapters, a genealogy chapter filled with names that we have struggle and have difficulty in trying to pronounce accurately or correctly, and so we kind of just breeze over it. We kind of just skip over that chapter. Just names. But it was important enough, at least through the eyes of the Holy Spirit, to have these names and have this section in God's holy written word. So when we come across these types of chapters, why is it so important? Why is it necessary to have these records within the Holy Scriptures? Well, we're going to get to that hopefully in our class session this morning. But chapter 36, For many, it was probably a difficult chapter, as I said, trying to just get through mentioning and pronouncing these names. But if you look at verse 1, the generations of who? Esau. So now we have, in chapter 36, the genealogy of Esau. Now, from your perspective of reading the scriptures and our study through Genesis so far, looking at the overall context, why is this genealogy recorded here?
So we have to know where Jesus came from.
We have to know where Jesus came from, but when we keep in mind the fact that this is the genealogy of Esau, which lineage did Jesus come from? Say it louder. I heard it. Jacob. Not Esau, but Jacob.
These are the people that they weren't supposed to intermarry with, all these generations. And Esau took a wife from here, so all his generations they were not of God's people.
They are not of God's people. So through this genealogy gives the birth to these nations, these outside nations that they have been commanded not to intermarry with. But we read verse 1 and we see that it's the genealogy or the generations of Esau, that is Edom. This verse completely summarizes all that one reads within the chapter. But even though Esau was not chosen in the same way Jacob had been, God still blessed him. Did he not? God still blessed him by giving him the land of Seir, or Edom. But further, through Esau's lineage, God established a nation and he fulfilled his word. The genealogy of Esau given in this chapter includes some of the kings of the peoples whom God promised would come from Abraham and Sarah. If you go back real quickly to chapter 17. Chapter 17, verse 6. He says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. If you scroll a little bit further down to verse 16, it says, I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of peoples shall come from her. Pretty interesting.
Well, I think that it does help give a short-term fulfillment of the prophecy, which ultimately would be fulfilled in later Israel and then Christ.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's a couple other reasons, because Scripture often has lots of reasons for what it has.
Oh, yeah.
So I think one of the other things that we see for the reason the list of kings is here is it's also a story of what might have been.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the lessons of Scripture is what might have happened had you chosen differently. And so had Esau not been the kind of person he was, his descendants, all these people, all these nations, would have had a chance at something much greater.
Mm-hmm.
Not only that, but this is going to show why the betrayal of the Edomites later
That's right.
is such a big thing.
Mm-hmm.
They are close relatives and close kin. All the Edomites later, the entire book of Obadiah is all about
That's
the
right.
Edomite betrayal.
Mm-hmm.
And you have lots of other prophecies written about the betrayal by the Edomites at the fall of Israel, the betrayal by the Edomites during the history. This kind of shows why that's such a big deal.
That's right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is going to be set in place for all the events that's going to take place later on with the Edomites. And as you said, the book of Obadiah, I had it here in my notes as well, along with the whole entire betrayal of the Edomites. And so this is an important aspect to know that, yes, God fulfilled his word in the past, but it's also purposeful for in the future of what's going to be come to place with the Edomite people. And so, when we read chapter 36, or at least from reading it once a day this past week, what were at least some lessons that you were hoping to discover from chapter 36? Yes, it is true that even though it's just a chapter filled with a bunch of names, there's still some lessons that we can learn from this chapter. One lesson is what we just stated from verse 1. From one man, great nations can arise. From one man, great nations can arise. And who is that one man from verse 1? Esau. Esau. And again, this goes back to God fulfilling his word, and also the great nations that's going to be set in stone later on throughout the Old Testament.
Learned here also that Esau didn't want to face Jacob, so he took all his family and left.
Mm-hmm.
So that shows you that they did not really get along, maybe.
Well, we see that at the end of chapter 35, verse 27 through 29. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So from what we discussed last week, towards the end of our lesson, we see that Jacob and Esau being brought together once again. Of course, from this setting, it is through funeral arrangements. And a lesson that we can learn is that, yeah, funerals can serve a good purpose of families being able to reconcile with one another, but also serves a great purpose and a great lesson for us to understand that with our families, we shouldn't get together just at funerals. We should learn to get together always. So in verse 36, chapter 36, we do see the fact that Jacob and Esau did end up departing ways. Esau took his wives, verse 2, from the Canaanites. So it seems that they did, in fact, go their separate ways in the end. But from chapter 36, verse 6, something interesting points out. It says, Then Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all the members of his household, his livestock, all his beasts, and all his property that he had acquired in the land of Canaan. He went into a land away from his brother. So, yes, we do see them together at the funeral arrangement, burying their father. And then we see him taking his wives, all his possessions, and going his separate ways. So it seems that Jacob came to Esau, but Esau made the decision to part from his brother.
Verse 7 kind of explains that.
Verse 7?
Yes.
Go ahead and read it if you like.
For their riches were more than they might dwell together.
Mhm.
The land wherein they were strangers could not bear them because of their cattle. They had so many cattle and it wouldn't support their both families, both brothers.
Mm-hmm.
It was too much. So
It was too much. There you go. For their possessions were too great for them to dwell together. Scott?
Now, this is also where Esau had already left to go to before. Back in chapters 31 and 32,
Yes.
he had basically established himself in that country. And so while he comes back for the funeral, he's not necessarily back permanently. And so
Yes.
the concept of him moving away is not necessarily that he's leaving his brother now, it's that he's going back home.
Mm-hmm.
And he realized we can't stay here. And he probably didn't bring all his cattle and livestock to the funeral. But he's probably realizing, now it's time for us to split up into our separate ways. Because even before Jacob returned, he had left to go down to the land of Edom and Seir, the mountains of Seir. Because that's where Jacob found him back in chapter 32. He was dwelling in the land of Seir. So he had already left Canaan to go there.
Yes, correct. Somebody look at verse 31.
Now these were the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the children of Israel.
All right, thank you. It's interesting that when we look and read verse 31, because the presence of evil influences began to develop long before their effects are felt on God's people. The kings were forming all around the nation of Israel. And one day, they themselves would desire a king like the nations around them. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 5 and 6. It's pretty interesting. Pretty interesting about how all these nations and everything really came out of Abraham, out of Sarah, out of Isaac, Esau, intermarrying with all the Canaanites, and all these kings are starting to begin to sprout up. And these very kings are going to be the nations surrounding Israel, and they're going to give off that evil influence of Israel saying, we want to be just like our nations around us. Kings come and go, but what about God? He's there forever. It's very interesting when you really put the pieces together, because here they are. They are wanting to be just like the nations around them, when they themselves already had a king from the very beginning. Even before the birth of all these nations and before the birth and the sprouts of all of these kings, they have already had one the entire time. One that was eternal and there forever. And they traded what was eternal for something that was just going to be temporary. Kings on this earth don't live forever. So again, the question I think is very relevant for us today, especially with everything that's going on with our upcoming election. Where is our dependence upon? Ours should always be entirely dependent upon the everlasting, eternal King. It doesn't say that we're not allowed to be involved in everything. I mean, I did an entire lesson answering that question last Sunday morning. We should be involved, and we should have a good influence towards the politics and towards our relationship with the government. But in the end, our entire dependence should always be on the eternal, everlasting King who reigns forever and who's in control of all things. He's the one, keep in mind, he's the one that was in control of sprouting all of these nations and all of these kings. He was in control from the very beginning, and he is still in control today. So, lesson for us is the fact that yes, even though all the nations around us, even though the presidency, all those who are in office, in the end, where should our entire dependence be on? It should be on the eternal, everlasting King. Any thoughts? Questions on that? Any rebuttals? Objections? Speak now. Forever hold your
I think
peace.
a lot of times that's what we want. That's what we do with ourselves. We want to be like somebody else that's around us or have things other people have.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not ours to do that with. We just have to put our trust in God to do what's best for us.
Absolutely.
Make the best decisions.
Absolutely. Instead of being like our neighbors around us, we need to be more like who? Just like God. Just like Jesus. And again, that goes back to one of my favorite memes that I would see on social media. It would say that what people think of me how I think of myself, how my family thinks of me, but in the end, what God thinks of me is the only thing that matters. What God thinks of me is the only thing that matters. So who are we want to be like? Are we trying to mold ourselves into someone that others want us to be, or someone or something that we want to be? Or are we molding ourselves into the way that God wants us to be?
Well, we told the Father Jesus, and we're walking in his footsteps. That's what we do. We become like him.
That's right. When we follow in his footsteps, when we allow his word to change and transform our lives. And in order for us to allow his word to change and transform our lives, we got to be open and honest with ourselves and apply the things that we've learned from his word. When we do that, that is when that transformation is coming. That is when we're going to be imitating Jesus. And that is when we are going to be walking in the light as he's in the light. That is when we are going to be abiding in him. See, it all connects together, really, when you think about it. Especially with our study and on Wednesday nights with through John's epistles, through 1 John. That is what he's saying, is that when you're abiding in the truth, when you are practicing it, when you are doing it, when you are imitating Jesus, that is when you're going to start looking more and more like him. Any other thoughts on that? Are there any other lessons or interesting discoveries that you found from the text of Genesis 36?
Corey, one of the things I've always just thought, and this may kind of get us off the train tracks here, but when I think of genealogies, I get to reading through, and I know there's a lot of good stuff in there, but I get about 5 verses in, and I'm going, I don't want to keep up with all this, you know. And you know, I'm a math teacher, right? And so the other day I was teaching some of the kids in my class. We were talking about big number estimations, and the example that the book gave us was actually estimating the number of sand pieces in the earth. And I got to thinking that was the promise that God gave to Abraham, was that his descendants would be as numerous as the sand of the seashore. Mm-hmm. And I just got to thinking, you know, God actually knows, like, our numbers. Mm-hmm. And I get a couple names in, and I'm like, it's a good thing I'm not God, because, you know, I don't want to keep up with all this. And, you know, I know there's good things in there. I'm not even taking away from that. I just get to thinking that God knows all of us. He knows the number of hairs on our head. I just get to thinking big numbers like that. That's impressive. And what it boils down to is God is not just doing that because he's curious or because he said so, like he made that promise, so he had to keep it. But he wants a relationship with everyone. He loves everyone. You have to have that motivation in order to keep up with all these names, and that's what allows him to do that, being all-knowing, all-loving. But I just thought of that because those numbers, seeing that type of a list, that's just a short, you know, hitting a couple highlights. But God has all of man's genealogy listed, and he cares about all of it.
Yep, so absolutely. It kind of reminded me a little bit of, have you seen the movie Bruce Almighty?
I have not, actually.
You have not? There's that scene where he's listening, he's hearing all his voices in his head, and he's like scratching his ear, and then they kind of go away for a little bit, and they start coming back again, and so he goes and starts talking to God, and he's like, man, I'm hearing all the prayers of the world. And he goes, oh, those are not the prayers of the entire world. That's only just about half of Chicago down the street. And then so it just kind of reminded me of that, you know, as he mentioned, saying that all those big numbers, I mean, in God and how He knows our number. He knows the number of our days here on this earth. He knows the number of the hair on our heads. He knows the number. He knows everyone's number. And He listens and He hears everyone that's there. And that He wants to be in a relationship with everyone around the world. And so that's a great point. And it also kind of reminded me a little bit as well with if anyone's actually looking for like a new TV show that's more influential, one that you can actually watch. Angel and I, we just finished one called The Chosen. You seen that? Well, you can get it if you have like maybe like an iPhone, and if you are pretty good on knowing how to use it. There's an app that you go to. You just type in The Chosen, and it's free. And so far, you can watch all of season 1, and it's got 9.8 stars out of 10. And it's literally just about the life of Jesus. And it's told from a perspective, from a view that's a little bit different. It's told from the view and the perspective of the people who have encountered Jesus. It talks about the woman who's filled with just a bunch of demons. It talks about the leper, his point of view, what it was that he was going through in his life, feeling rejected, feeling lonely, feeling that nobody wants to touch him, nobody wants to be around him at all. And then he encounters Jesus on the road and seeing him change his life. It talks about the conversation that Cornelius has with Jesus. And so, anyways, if you're looking for a good show to watch, we recommend it. We recommend it. Watch it. It is just outstanding. And I'll be honest, I cried about every episode at the end. I did. At the end, I cried just about every episode. It is just amazing what they did and how they did it. But anyways, sorry, not trying to advertise that. Forgive me if it sounded like that, but that's not what I was trying to do. But I was trying to bring the point up to the fact that how all these nations and all these kings began to sprout around. Israel wanted to be like the nations around them. They wanted to have a king like the other nations. What about the Messiah? What kind of view did they have about the Messiah? They thought that he was going to come in what kind of way?
Like a warrior.
Like a warrior. Like a physical king. He's going to bring a physical nation that's going to destroy all other nations. But what did they find out when he finally came? Yes, I have a kingdom that I'm bringing, but it's not of this world. Our war is not against flesh and blood, but against the powers, the principalities, and the powers of the heavenly realm. It was all about spiritual. It was all about eternal when Jesus came. Scott?
Well, a couple more quick points is, as you read through the chapter, it's interesting that first you have Esau, and then it was Esau's sons, and then the chiefs descended from his sons, and then the kings after that. And so you have this gradual process where they keep getting further from it just being about Esau running his family, and then Esau's sons running their families, and then Esau's sons becoming chiefs in charge of larger groups. And then after that, you get down to kings, which is farthest from what it ought to be. And at that point now, they're presumably dominating their own brethren.
Yeah.
Because that's actually how earthly kings work. And the evolution of the earthly king was you would have somebody that was bigger and stronger and more capable who could impose their will upon you and or help defend you from others. And that was the two-part thing was, yes, you were going to do what they said because they were the biggest, strongest guy, but you then had the biggest, strongest guy on your side if you got in a fight, which is why King Saul, who was described as being head and shoulders above every other man in Israel, was viewed by the people as, wow, this is a king. And when Samuel went to David's family to find the next king, he kept looking at his older brothers, who were these big, imposing physical specimens, and said, this is the guy. This has got to be the guy God wants. Because he's an impressive physical specimen.
That's right.
And God says, that's not quite how it works.
Yep.
But that's the interesting thing is you start off with Esau, who was an
Impressive guy.
physical person.
Yes, he was.
And then it goes to his sons, who are presumably going to be impressive physical specimens. And then their sons decide to start imposing their will and become chieftains. Maybe they're just the respected people in their clans. And then they say, you know what, we can be in charge of it all. They become kings.
Yep.
And it's easy to let a little bit of power go to your head.
That is right.
And
Yes.
so you see that gradually happening over generations here.
Yep.
Where it's going from, I'm going to do what I want, I don't care what the consequences are, Esau, to I'm going to do what I want because I can, to you're going to do what I want because I can make you.
That's right. And it's interesting because by the time we get to the book of Kings and Chronicles, I always see it as like mafia warfare, basically. They start forming these foreign alliances with one another, and then they start just giving a little bit of power. It can easily bring corruption. What's that old saying goes? With great power comes with great responsibility. And what's the other way around of it when you are not being responsible of it? Power corrupts. Yeah. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. Any other thoughts, any other remarks, questions on chapter 36? If not, then I'll give you 5 minutes extra. And we'll come back next week with chapter 37, where we're going to be introduced to most likely the last main character of the book of Genesis.
At least we can pronounce his name.
At least we can pronounce his name, Joseph, yep. Or in Hebrew, it'll be Joseph. Yeah, Joseph. Rough breathing. Thank y'all so much for your attention and your participation, your questions, your comments. I always love Bible class discussions. Thank you so much, and next week we will come back with chapter 37. Again, this morning, as I mentioned last week, this evening, live on Facebook that is, we definitely are going to be listening to two wonderful speakers. This morning, Brother Scott will be bringing us the message, and this evening, Brother Hunter will be bringing us the message. So very thankful for their willingness to serve and their wonderful, skillful talent that God has blessed them with to deliver us the message.